The air in the signal's hut was thick, a palpable stew of humidity, stale cigarette smoke, and the low, insistent hum of valves and transformers. It clung to the skin, this air, heavy with the scent of overheated electronics and the faint, ever-present tang of salt from the Mediterranean, which lay like a sheet of hammered, dark iron under the moonless sky. Located in a bomb-scarred stone building on the island of Malta, the hut was a world unto itself, a sanctuary of frantic, focused noise in the vast, sleeping silence of the wartime night. Inside, a young man, Corporal Arthur Jenkins, hunched over his equipment. His face, pale and sharp in the sickly green glow of the cathode ray tube, was a mask of tired concentration. His eyes, red-rimmed from a 12-hour shift spent staring into the oscilloscope's ghostly light, tracked the dancing luminous line as it painted a landscape of invisible conflict across the dark glass. The headphones clamped over his ears were a second skin, a barrier against the world that funneled the chaos of the ether directly into his brain. It was a symphony of war, this noise, a cacophony of Morse code stuttering from a dozen different fronts, the ghostly wail of jamming signals, the hiss of pure, empty static that could, at any moment, coalesce into something vital. Arthur's world was one of fragments. He was an archivist of whispers, a librarian of half-heard secrets. He didn't see the grand strategy unfold on maps in war rooms. He heard it, piece by fractured piece, in the clipped, impersonal dots and dashes that spilled from his headphones. He knew the fist of certain German operators, the unique, rhythmic signature of their king style, as well as he knew the voices of his own mates. Some were sloppy, their Morse ragged and uneven, others were metronomes of precision, their transmissions clean and unadorned. Tonight, he was tuned to a specific slice of the spectrum, a frequency known to be favored by the German Afrika Korps communications network, the nervous system of Rommel's once invincible army, now bloodied and falling back across the North African desert. The Allied push had been relentless. Since the great victory at El Alamein the previous year, the tide had turned. Now, in the early months of 1943, the Axis forces were cornered in Tunisia, a final, shrinking bastion against the combined might of the British Eighth Army advancing from the east and the American and British forces from the west. The campaign was in its final, bloody act, and every scrap of intelligence was gold dust. Arthur's job was to pan for that gold in the rushing, electronic river of the airwaves. He reached for his chipped enamel mug, the tea within long gone cold and stewed, his movements automatic, his focus never leaving the sounds in his head. Then, a change, a new signal, faint and frayed at the edges by distance and atmospheric interference, shouldered its way through the background chatter. It was a voice transmission, not Morse. A German voice, tied with static, speaking in the clipped, professional tones of a military radio operator. He adjusted a dial, his fingers fine and sensitive on the bakelite knob. The signal strengthened, then faded, as if the source were on a moving vehicle, or perhaps the ionosphere itself was breathing, its layers shifting and undulating, sometimes allowing signals to travel vast distances, other times swallowing them whole. He leaned forward, his spine a tense curve, his entire being focused on the crackling voice. Achtung, Achtung. The voice began, the standard call for attention. Then, the details, swallowed by a burst of static that sounded like frying bacon. Arthur cursed under his breath, a soft, frustrated exhale. He strained, listening for the telltale unit identifiers, the grid references that were the cartography of battle. He caught fragments. Panzergruppe. The word was clear, laden with menace. A group of tanks, the mailed fist of the German war machine. Then, repositioned to sector, another wave of static crashed over the transmission, a roaring white noise that obliterated the next crucial piece of information, the sector designation. He waited, heart hammering against his ribs, a percussion of anxiety. The voice returned, clearer for a moment, as if the transmitting operator had leaned closer to his own microphone. Advance at dawn. And then, silence. Not the empty silence of a dead line, but the abrupt, final silence of a transmission cut off. The German operator had released his transmit button, and the space he had occupied in Arthur's universe vanished, leaving only the returning hiss of the void. Arthur sat back, pulling the headphones down to rest around his neck. The sudden absence of the focused signal made the ambient noise of the hut seem deafening. He picked up a pencil, its tip worn to a soft nub, and scrawled the fragments on a scrap of paper already stained with T-rings and smudges of ink. Panzergruppe. Reposition. Sector, unintelligible. Advance at dawn. It was a skeleton of a message. A ghost. It sounded important. It sounded desperately urgent. The words, "Advance at dawn," carried a specific, chilling weight in the lexicon of war. They spoke of planned offensives, of surprise attacks launched in the half-light when men were tired and visibility was poor. They were words that got people killed. But there was a problem, a dissonance that nagged at the corner of Arthur's trained mind. It wasn't just the poor reception. It was the sound of it. The frequency was right, a known Africa Corps channel, but the operator's voice. It was unfamiliar. And more than that, the call sign protocol had been rushed, almost sloppy. In the highly disciplined world of German military communications, such sloppiness was unusual, a small red flag waving in the electronic breeze. He replayed the transmission in his head, the sound etched into his memory. Panzergruppe, repositioned to sector, inaudible, advance at dawn. A mistake, he realized. Not in the content, but in the very act of transmission. Somewhere, in a dusty command truck or a sandbagged dugout along the Tunisian front, a German radio operator, tired, perhaps, or stressed, or simply careless, had committed a tiny, monumental error. He had used the wrong frequency. He had broadcast a piece of his army's soul into the void, a secret meant for a German panzer commander's ears alone, sent out on a wave that had, by chance and the strange physics of radio propagation, washed up on the shores of Malta, into the headphones of a tired British corporal. A tiny slip, a human error, the kind of mistake that happened a dozen times a day on both sides, messages lost in the noise, misdirected, garbled. A mistake no one should have noticed, lost in the immense, roaring static of a global war. Except someone did. Arthur Jenkins noticed. He carefully logged the time, the frequency, and the fragmented content of the message. He added a note of his own. Signal strength poor. Source operator unfamiliar. Possible transmission error on axis side. He then placed the scrap of paper into a metal basket, where it joined a dozen other intercepts from the night. A junior clerk would collect them on the hour, carrying them to the cipher-breaking teams and intelligence analysts in the labyrinthine basements below. There, in rooms filled with the clatter of Typex machines and the low murmur of conversation, his fragment would be cross-referenced with other intelligence, reconnaissance photos from high-flying Spitfires, reports from partisans on the ground, decrypts from the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. It was a single thread, a silken strand in a vast, dark tapestry. By itself, it meant almost nothing. A Panzergruppe was moving. It was always moving. An advance at dawn was a standard tactical procedure. But in the hands of the analysts, this thread would be woven with others. Perhaps a Luftwaffe signal, intercepted an hour earlier, requesting aerial reconnaissance over a specific valley. Perhaps a low-level Enigma transmission, decrypted the day before, mentioning shortages of fuel in a particular sector. Piece by piece, a picture would begin to form. Arthur took a deep breath, the stale air filling his lungs. He took a sip of the cold, bitter tea, grimaced, and pulled the headphones back over his ears, tuning back into the endless, whispering war. He had done his job. He had caught a ghost. He had no way of knowing that this particular ghost, this whisper of repositioning tanks and a dawn advance, was not just another piece of data. It was a key, a flawed one, that would unlock a series of events leading to a barren, fly-blown patch of North Africa known as Wadi Akarit. There, in the blood-soaked soil of that desolate gorge, the unnoticed mistake of a single, anonymous German radio operator would echo with the force of thunder, deciding the fate of thousands, and tipping the scales of an entire battle. The battle had not yet been joined, but its first, decisive shot had just been fired, not from a cannon, but from a radio, a shot heard only by one man, in a quiet, green-lit room, by the sea. The journey of the fragmented message from a humid signals hut in Malta to the heart of the British intelligence machine was a testament to the vast, intricate bureaucracy of secrecy that had been built to win the war. The scrap of paper, now tucked into a leather dispatch pouch, was flown first to Gibraltar on a twin-engine Hudson, the aircraft bucking and swaying in the turbulent air currents over the sea. From there, it was transferred to a faster, long-range Mosquito, which carried it through the hostile skies over occupied France, finally landing at a secret airfield in Buckinghamshire. A motorcycled courier, his face grim beneath his goggles, then sped the pouch through the winding country lanes, past unassuming signposts for a fictional, government communications headquarters, and through the reinforced gates of Bletchley Park. Bletchley was not a place of grand architecture or martial pomp. It was a sprawling, slightly shabby estate, a collection of Victorian manor houses and hastily constructed, single-story wooden huts that sprawled across the grounds like a fungal growth. Here, in these drafty, overcrowded buildings, some of the brightest minds in Britain, mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, classicists, waged a silent, relentless war against the encrypted machines of the Third Reich. The air was thick with the smell of cheap coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint, sweet odor of ozone from the humming, room-sized Colossus computers, the world's first semi-programmable electronic digital computers, which flickered and chatted in their temperature-controlled rooms. The message from Malta, now designated Intercept MT 77344, eventually found its way, after initial processing and translation, to a desk in Hut 6, the section dedicated to Army and Air Force Enigma traffic. The desk was one of dozens, crammed side by side in a long, low-ceilinged room lit by harsh, naked bulbs. The sound was a constant, low-grade roar, the clatter of teleprinters, the rustle of paper, the murmur of intense conversation, and the endless, rhythmic ticking of the clock, marking the passage of time, the most precious commodity in intelligence. At this desk sat Evelyn Hart. She was 22, a recent graduate of Somerville College, Oxford, where she had studied modern languages with a focus on German philology. She was not a cryptographer in the legendary sense, not one of the brilliant code breakers who wrestled with the theoretical underpinnings of the Enigma cipher. She was, in the vast and stratified hierarchy of Bletchley, a junior analyst. Her world was not the grand encryption, but the smaller, subtler code of military communication, the jargon, the protocols, the standard operating procedures that made up the daily language of the German war machine. She was a linguist, a grammarian of battle. Her job was to take the decoded fragments, the messages that had been successfully deciphered but were considered too low priority, too incomplete, or too obscure for immediate action, and file them, cross-reference them, and look for patterns everyone else was too busy to see. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, the intellectual equivalent of sifting through sand. Most of her colleagues saw it as a dead end, a posting for those who weren't quite brilliant enough for the real work. Evelyn, however, possessed a mind that thrived on detail. She had a near photographic memory for call signs and unit structures, and an intuitive feel for the rhythm and flow of German military radio traffic. She knew, for instance, that a certain Panzer Division's signals officer, a Hauptmann Weber, always signed off with a slightly extended final dash, a personal tick in an otherwise impersonal process. She knew that transmissions from the Afrika Korps headquarters had a specific, clipped formality, while those from frontline units were often more rushed, littered with slang and abbreviations. When Intercept MT 77344 landed on her desk, it was just one more piece of paper in a towering tray. She smoothed it out, her eyes scanning the brief text. Panzergruppe, reposition to sector, inaudible, advance at dawn. At first glance, it was unremarkable, a routine movement order, but something prickled at the back of her neck, a subtle dissonance that her trained mind picked up on immediately. She pulled out her personal ledger, a thick, cloth-bound notebook filled with her meticulous handwriting, lists of known German call signs, unit designations, and their associated frequencies and protocols. She began to cross-reference. The frequency was correct for the area of operations. The term Panzergruppe was appropriate, but the specific unit identifier mentioned in the partial message, it didn't fit. According to all other traffic she had seen over the past 48 hours, that particular Panzer battalion was supposed to be nearly 80 miles to the north, engaged in a holding action against the Americans. There were no prior signals indicating a planned redeployment of that scale, no requests for additional fuel or ammunition to support such a move, no logistical tail. It was as if a ghost unit had suddenly materialized on the battlefield. Then she looked at the structure of the message itself. The call signs were wrong. They were from the correct family of identifiers, but they were arranged in a sequence that was slightly off protocol. It was sloppy. Not the sloppiness of a harried operator under fire, but the sloppiness of someone using a template incorrectly, or perhaps improvising. German signals discipline was legendary, a product of their love of order and procedure. This message felt haphazard. It was a forgery, but not a deliberate one. It was a forgery born of error. Her heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't just a routine message. This was a crack in the facade. Something had gone very, very wrong on the other end. An operator, under immense pressure, perhaps with his command post being shelled or overrun, had made a series of mistakes. He'd used an old call sign list. He'd broadcast on a frequency that was either incorrect or poorly chosen, leading to the garble that Malta had intercepted. He had, in his panic or fatigue, created a signal that was both genuine in its intent and fundamentally flawed in its execution. Evelyn picked up a pen and, on a fresh analysis sheet, wrote in her neat, precise script, high priority. Source appears authentic but content contradicts established unit positioning and signal protocol. High probability of significant operational transmission error on part of Axis operator. Suggests possible, unplanned, rapid redeployment of Panzer assets. She stood, the wooden legs of her chair scraping against the bare floorboards, and carried the message and her analysis to the desk of her section chief, a perpetually harassed-looking man named Pembroke. He barely glanced up from his own mountain of paper. Pembroke, sir, I have an intercept from the Tunisian front. I believe it indicates a critical flaw in the enemy's communications. A panzergruppe appears to be moving without orders, or with severely corrupted ones. Pembroke took the proffered sheets, his eyes scanning them with weary skepticism. Hart, is it? This is a fragment. We get dozens of these a day. Half the time it's misdirection, the other half it's some poor sod of a German clerk getting his wires crossed. The protocol is wrong, sir, Evelyn insisted, her voice calm but firm. It's not just the content. The way it's sent. It's a breach of their own discipline. That tells me the situation on the ground is fluid. Chaotic. Fluid and chaotic describes the entire Tunisian pocket. Hart, Pembroke sighed, handing the papers back to her. File it. Cross-reference it with the morning's decryptions. If it's real, it'll show up again. No, sir, I don't think it will, Evelyn said, a flush of frustration rising to her cheeks. I think this was a one-off mistake. A mistake no one on their side has even noticed. If we wait for confirmation, it will be too late. The advance at dawn is the key. That's a tactical timeline. Pembroke looked at her properly for the first time, his expression a mixture of irritation and pity. You're a junior analyst. Your job is to file and cross-reference, not to speculate on grand strategy. Now, please, get back to work. We have a war to win, and it's not won by chasing ghosts. Defeated, Evelyn returned to her desk, but she did not file the message. She placed it squarely in the center of her blotter, the words, advance at dawn, seeming to pulse with a menacing energy. She was certain, as certain as she had ever been about anything. It was a feeling in her gut, an intellectual conviction born from 1,000 hours of studying the enemy's linguistic fingerprints. This was real, and it was critical. Later that afternoon, a different kind of energy filled Hut 6. A visiting delegation from the War Office was being given a tour, a rare event meant to reassure the brass that their investment in this odd collection of professors and students was paying off. The head of the delegation was Brigadier Sir Lawrence Brooke, a tall, ramrod straight man in his 50s with a neat grey moustache and eyes that missed nothing. He was the newly appointed overseer of North African intelligence, a man who had seen firsthand the cost of bad information in the Desert War. As Brooke and his entourage moved through the hut, Pembroke was frantically pointing out successes, his voice sycophantic. Brooke listened politely, but his gaze wandered, taking in the faces of the young men and women bent over their work. His eyes fell on Evelyn Hart. While everyone else was trying to look busy and important, she was utterly still, staring at a single piece of paper on her desk as if it were a holy relic. Her expression was one of intense, frustrated concentration. Brooke broke away from the group and walked over to her desk. Pembroke scurried after him, looking alarmed. Everything quite all right, miss? Brooke asked, his voice a quiet baritone. Evelyn looked up, startled. Hart, sir. Evelyn Hart. She glanced at Pembroke's panicked face, then back at the brigadier. She saw intelligence in his eyes, not just rank. It was a gamble, but it was the only one she had. No, sir, she said, her voice clear and steady. Everything is not all right. She picked up Intercept MT 773-44 and her analysis sheet and handed them to him. I believe we are about to walk into a trap at Wadi Akarat. The room seemed to freeze. Pembroke looked as if he were about to have an aneurysm. Brooke took the papers, his brow furrowing as he read. He read them once, then again, more slowly. He ignored the fragmentary message and focused on Evelyn's analysis. Explain, he said, his voice still quiet, but now laced with a new intensity. Evelyn did. She spoke for 3 minutes without interruption, outlining the discrepancies in the call signs, the illogical unit movement, the breach of standard radio procedure, and the ominous, specific timing of advance at dawn. She connected it to other, seemingly minor intercepts, a spike in German signals traffic in that sector the previous evening, a single, garbled Luftwaffe request for map coordinates that had been dismissed as an error. The Germans are consolidating their armor, sir, she concluded. They're pulling a Panzergruppe from the northern flank and rushing it south, to Wadi Akarit. They've identified it as the linchpin. Our own plans, Operation Scipio, call for a major assault through that exact wadi at first light tomorrow. If this message is genuine, our infantry will advance straight into a killing zone dominated by dug-in Mark IVs and Tigers. Brooke was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on her. He was weighing 1,000 things at once, the credibility of a young, junior analyst against the entire planning staff of the 8th Army, the cost of a delay against the cost of a massacre. Brigadier, I must protest, Pembroke spluttered. This is pure conjecture, based on a misheard radio transmission. We cannot possibly alter a major offensive on the word of a filing clerk. Brooke ignored him. He kept his gaze on Evelyn. If this were genuine, he asked, his voice low and deliberate, what battle would it affect? She answered instantly, without a moment's hesitation. The one we haven't started yet, sir. That was it. The perfect, succinct summary of the catastrophe that awaited. The battle they had planned, the one drawn on maps in comfortable headquarters far from the front, would be stillborn. The real battle, the one the Germans were preparing, would be a slaughter. Brooke made a decision that defied all military convention, all chain of command, all common sense. He trusted the intern. Come with me, he said to Evelyn. To Pembroke, he said, get me a secure line to General Alexander's headquarters in Tunis. Now. The next 12 hours were a blur of controlled chaos that stretched from the quiet countryside of Bletchley to the sun-baked command posts of North Africa. In the map room at Allied Force headquarters, the air was thick with tension and the smell of sweat and coffee. Brigadier Brooke, his authority bolstered by the raw certainty of his source, stood before General Harold Alexander and his staff, including the formidable General Bernard Montgomery, architect of the upcoming assault. The intelligence is fragmentary, I grant you, Brooke argued, pointing to the map of the Wadi Akarit position. But the analysis is sound. My analyst is convinced the Germans have shifted the 15th Panzer Division into these foothills overnight, on the basis of one broken transmission. Monty said, his tone icy with skepticism. He tapped the map with his swagger stick. This operation has been months in the planning, Brooke. The artillery timetables alone are a work of art. You're asking me to scrap it because a girl at Bletchley thinks she heard a ghost. The ghost has the potential to kill 10,000 men before breakfast, Brooke retorted, his patience fraying. We have to delay, just for 24 hours. Let us get aerial reconnaissance over the area at first light. If I'm wrong, you can court-martial me. If I'm right, you will have saved the 8th Army from a bloody nose it cannot afford. The debate was fierce. Logisticians cursed the impossibility of halting the vast, intricate machine that was a modern army on the move. Divisional commanders, their men already moving into jump-off positions, yelled down the telephone lines, accusing Brooke of cowardice and incompetence. The air in the room was blue with cigar smoke and profanity. It was a colossal gamble, a bet placed on the intuition of a 22-year-old woman against the collective wisdom of the entire Allied High Command. But Alexander, a commander known for his calm judgment, ultimately saw the grim logic. The cost of being wrong and delaying was a day lost. The cost of being wrong and attacking was a division shattered. Just after midnight, the orders went out. All along the front, a ripple of confusion and disbelief spread. Units that had been creeping forward under cover of darkness were halted in their tracks. Artillery batteries, the guns already laid on pre-planned targets, were told to stand down. The great clockwork mechanism of Operation Scipio ground to a sudden, jarring halt. In the ranks, men who had been steeling themselves for the dawn attack sat in their trenches, bewildered and anxious. What had gone wrong? As the first grey fingers of light stretched across the Tunisian landscape on the morning the attack was supposed to have happened, a pair of high-flying, photo-reconnaissance Spitfires from No. 683 Squadron streaked over the Wadi Akarit sector. Their cameras, sophisticated pieces of glass and precision engineering, clicked silently, capturing thousands of square yards of terrain in minute detail. The film was rushed back to base, developed in mobile darkrooms, and the wet prints were analyzed by frantic photo interpreters. They peered through magnifying glasses at the patterns of shadow and light, and what they saw made their blood run cold. There, cleverly camouflaged among the rocks and scrub of the wadi, were the distinct, boxy shapes of armored vehicles. Not a few, but dozens of them. The interpreters identified the long barrels of Panzerkampfwagen IVs and the hulking, unmistakable profiles of Tiger tanks. The photos showed fresh tank tracks leading into concealed revetments, and the dug-in positions of supporting infantry and anti-tank guns. It was a textbook defensive killing zone, perfectly laid. The 15th Panzer Division had indeed moved under cover of darkness. They were waiting. The reconnaissance photos were flashed to headquarters. When they were laid on the table before Alexander and his staff, the room fell silent. The evidence was irrefutable. Monty, for once, had no sharp words. He simply stared at the photographs, then nodded slowly at Brigadier Brooke. The message was clear. They had been saved from a disaster of their own making. The Battle of Wadi Akarit was fought the following day. It was still a brutal, costly affair, a grinding infantry assault against a determined enemy in strong defensive terrain. But it was not the massacre it would have been. The British plan had been completely revised. Instead of a headlong charge into the wadi, a massive, concentrated artillery bombardment hammered the German panzer positions for hours, softening them up. The infantry then advanced on a broader front, outflanking the strongest points. The element of surprise was gone, but so was the German trap. The battle was a hard-fought Allied victory, a crucial step in the final collapse of the Axis forces in North Africa. And it had been 1 day before the first shot was fired, in a signals hut in Malta and at a junior analyst's desk at Bletchley Park. It was won not by a general's brilliant maneuver or a soldier's bravery, but by a chain of perception and courage, a radio operator who heard a ghost, a young woman who understood its meaning, and a general who had the wisdom to listen. Everything had changed. Because of one broken transmission, a mistake no one was supposed to notice, a whisper in the static that echoed into history. The silence was the most unnerving part. Along the British lines, dug into the rocky, sun-scorched soil overlooking the Wadi Akarit, men waited. They had been prepared for hell at first light, the scream of incoming shells, the rattle of machine guns, the guttural roar of a German counterattack. They had braced themselves for the sight of panzers, those dark, predatory shapes, emerging from the dust and smoke. Officers had their whistles ready, their watches synchronized for the moment they would lead their men over the top. But the moment never came. The dawn broke, not with a symphony of destruction, but with an eerie, almost peaceful quiet. The sun rose, a great orange ball over the desert, painting the world in hues of gold and ochre. The only sounds were the whisper of a dry wind through the wadi and the distant, plaintive cry of a desert lark. Binoculars and periscopes scanned the German positions. Nothing moved. There were no telltale muzzle flashes, no dust plumes from advancing vehicles, no distant rumble of tank engines. In the command dugouts, a different kind of tension took hold. Brigadier Brooke stood with General Alexander, both men peering through powerful scopes at the enemy lines. "Where are they, Brooke?" Alexander murmured, his voice low. "If they're in there, why aren't they hitting us? We're sitting ducks if they've brought up their artillery." Brooke didn't have an answer. The intelligence had been so clear, so certain. The panzers were there. The reconnaissance photos proved it. So why this silence? It was as if the entire German army had vanished in the night. Or, more terrifyingly, as if they were waiting for something, a trap within a trap. Hours ticked by. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. The men in the trenches grew restless, the adrenaline of anticipated battle slowly leaching away, leaving behind a corrosive brew of confusion and anxiety. Back at Bletchley, Evelyn Hart, who had been given a temporary station in the signals room to monitor any related traffic, heard nothing. The German airwaves in that sector were preternaturally quiet. It was a vacuum, a void where the expected storm of battle communications should have been. The truth, unfolding 80 miles away in the German headquarters of the 5th Panzer Army, was a masterpiece of tragicomic confusion. The source of the chaos was a man named Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer, a signals officer attached to the 15th Panzer Division's training battalion. Fischer was a competent, if somewhat pedantic, officer, frustrated by his posting away from the front lines. He was tasked with training new radio operators, Green recruits who had just arrived from Germany, their heads filled with theory but lacking the hard-won instinct of survival. The previous evening, in a dusty tent behind the lines, Fisher had been conducting a routine drill. He was simulating a high-pressure combat situation, using a real, functioning Enigma machine and a live radio set, a common, if risky, practice to add realism. He was issuing mock orders to his trainees. Achtung, Achtung, he had dictated, as a young Gefreiter, his hands shaking slightly, tapped out the message on the Enigma. Panzergruppe Becker, reposition to Sector 79er. Advance at dawn. It was a standard training scenario. The trainees were then supposed to decode the message, plot the movement on a map, and issue the corresponding logistical requests. But in the dim light of the tent, with the pressure of the exercise and the constant, background anxiety of the worsening military situation, a critical error occurred. The Gefreiter, flustered and tired, had set his radio to the wrong frequency. Instead of the closed, internal training network, he had accidentally broadcast the encoded practice message on a live, operational frequency reserved for frontline panzer commands. The message had shot out into the ether, a phantom order, a ghost command. And it had been received, not by the British first, but by the command staff of the actual Panzergruppe Becker, dug in near the northern flank of the German line. The operator there, hearing the call sign of his own unit, decoded it without a second thought. The order was bizarre. It pulled them away from a secure, fortified position and sent them on a night march to a secondary sector, WW2, for a dawn advance that made little tactical sense. But it was a valid Enigma encoded transmission, bearing all the correct cryptographic signatures. In the German army, one did not question orders, one obeyed them. The commander of Panzergruppe Becker, a veteran colonel named Strauss, had scowled at the message. This makes no sense, he grumbled to his adjutant. We are holding the line here. To move now would expose our entire left flank. Has command lost its mind? But the order was an order. To question it was to risk court-martial. Perhaps, he reasoned, High Command knew something he did not. Perhaps a major Allied push was expected elsewhere, and his panzers were needed as a fire brigade. With great reluctance, he gave the command. All through the night, his tanks and half-tracks, their engines grumbling in low gear, had rumbled south, leaving a gaping hole in the German defenses that High Command knew nothing about. By the time the sun rose on the day of the expected British attack, the confusion was absolute. At German Army High Command in Tunisia, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was poring over maps, expecting reports of a victorious defensive battle at the northern sector where Panzergruppe Becker was stationed. Instead, he received frantic, confused messages from the infantry divisions in that sector, reporting that the panzers that were supposed to be their steel backbone had vanished. No one had informed them of a redeployment. Simultaneously, from the WW2 sector, came reports from the 21st Panzer Division commander, who was now wondering why on earth Panzergruppe Becker was arriving unannounced in his operational area, clogging his supply routes and demanding fuel and ammunition for an advance he had no orders for. Kesselring was livid. Who gave this order? He demanded, his voice a whip crack of fury. Find me the man who moved an entire Panzergruppe without my authorization. The radio waves, silent to the British, were now screaming with internal German recriminations. Strauss, realizing his mistake, was desperately trying to explain that he had acted on a direct, encoded order. The signals branch was frantically checking logs, trying to find the source of the transmission. Oberleutnant Fischer, listening to the real-world chaos erupting over the airwaves, sat in his training tent, his face pale with a dawning, horrific understanding. He checked his trainee's radio set. He saw the frequency selection, and his blood ran cold. He had not just trained a recruit that night, he had inadvertently moved an army. While the German command structure was paralyzed in a vicious circle of blame and denial, the morning sun revealed the consequences of the disarray to the waiting Allies. A young British lieutenant, a reconnaissance officer with the King's Royal Rifle Corps, was peering through his telescope from a hidden observation post on a ridge overlooking the German lines. His job was to spot artillery fall, but there was nothing to spot. Boredom and professional curiosity led him to sweep his lens further north, beyond the immediate wadi, along the line where the German defenses were supposed to link up. He adjusted the focus, his eye pressed against the rubber cup. The landscape was a blur of rock and shadow. Then he saw it. Or rather, he didn't see it. There were no trenches. No gun emplacements. No telltale signs of prepared defenses. It was just empty desert. A mile-wide gap between two German infantry divisions. It was a cartographer's dream and a general's fantasy. It was a hole. A perfect, clean, strategically absurd hole in the middle of the enemy line. He couldn't believe it. He checked his maps, triple-checked his coordinates. He signaled his sergeant to confirm the sighting. There was no mistake. The Germans had left the back door wide open. The message was relayed up the chain of command with electric speed. It reached Brigadier Brooke just as he was beginning to doubt his own judgment, the eerie silence gnawing at his confidence. "Sir, you need to see this," his aide said, laying a new reconnaissance report on the map table. Brooke read it. Then he read it again. He looked at Alexander, a wild, incredulous hope dawning in his eyes. He walked to the large situation map on the wall. His finger traced the British line, then stabbed at the reported gap in the German defenses. "Here," he said, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. "The entire offensive goes through here. Now." The order sparked a frenzy of activity that made the previous night's repositioning seem orderly. The entire British battle plan, which had been painstakingly reworked to avoid the Panzer trap in the Wadi, was now torn up and thrown out. Orders were shouted, not written. Dispatch riders on motorcycles roared out of headquarters, kicking up plumes of dust. Regiments that had been poised to assault the heavily defended Wadi were now wheeling to the north, marching at a forced pace towards the inexplicable gap. They advanced not into a storm of steel, but into empty, sun-baked terrain. Lead units, expecting ambush at any moment, pushed through the undefended corridor. They met no resistance. By the time they emerged on the other side, they were not in front of the German lines, but behind them. The scene they encountered was one of pure, unadulterated chaos. The German rear echelons, supply depots, field kitchens, artillery parks, command posts, were completely unprepared for an attack from this direction. Staff officers, who moments before had been arguing over phantom orders, now found themselves staring down the barrels of British rifles. Panzergruppe Becker, the very force whose mistaken movement had created this disaster, was now caught in the worst possible position for an armored unit, stationary, low on fuel, and surrounded. Their formidable Tigers and Panzer IVs, designed to destroy enemies to their front, were impotent as British infantry swarmed their positions from the flanks and rear, disabling them with grenades and sticky bombs. The German communications network, already tangled, collapsed entirely. Isolated units, receiving conflicting and panicked orders, fought and died without coordination. Commanders who had been blaming each other for the mistaken movement were now cut off from their men. The battle that the British High Command had expected to be a week-long, bloody slugging match became a rout. It was over by late afternoon. As the sun set, casting long, distorted shadows across a battlefield littered with the captured and the dead, the scale of the victory began to sink in. An entire Panzergruppe had been neutralized, thousands of prisoners taken, and the backbone of the German defense in central Tunisia had been shattered. The path to Tunis was now open. In a quiet office at Bletchley Park, a final decoded German transmission came through. It was a message from Field Marshal Kesselring to Berlin, a somber admission of catastrophic defeat. The cause, he stated, was a severe and irreparable breakdown in communications and command control, leading to a fatal tactical dislocation. Brigadier Brooke found Evelyn Hart still at her station, her face pale with exhaustion. He placed the decoded message on her desk. "It seems," he said, a faint, weary smile touching his lips, "we were both right and wrong. The message was a mistake, but it was a mistake that started a chain reaction. They were confused because they were listening to their own ghosts." Evelyn read the message. The breakdown in communications. She understood. The second, catastrophic mistake. The training order obeyed as truth. Two mistakes. One from each side. A British analyst who trusted a flawed signal, and a German colonel who obeyed a phantom order. Both unnoticed in the moment. Both catastrophic in their confluence. The Battle of Wadi Akarit, a battle that wasn't supposed to be won, had been decided not by the general who gave the final order, but by the junior signals officer who broadcast a practice drill, and the young woman who heard the echo of his error across 1,000 miles of war-torn sky. It was a victory forged not in the fires of flawless planning, but in the fragile, human realm of chance, perception, and mistake. The victory at Wadi Akarit was immediate front-page news. In London, newspapers trumpeted the brilliant flanking maneuver at the Wadi, and Alexander's masterstroke. The communiques from Allied Force headquarters, carefully crafted by teams of public relations officers, painted a picture of flawless military execution. They spoke of bold commanders who had outthought the Desert Fox, of reconnaissance pilots who had spotted a weakness, of a battle plan flexibly and brilliantly adapted at the last moment to exploit an enemy error. It was a narrative of genius, a tale to bolster a weary home front and demoralize a reeling enemy. General Sir Harold Alexander, ever the gentleman, gracefully accepted the plaudits. In his official dispatch, he wrote of the superb initiative and flexibility of the 8th Army, and the timely intelligence which allowed for a decisive alteration of our plans. It was all true, in its way, but it was a veneer, a polished and sanitized version of events, stripped of its chaotic, human core. The story of the confused German training officer and the junior analyst at Bletchley Park had no place in this triumphant narrative. It was too messy, too reliant on chance, too undermining of the image of infallible military command. In the officers' clubs of Cairo and Algiers, the talk was of maneuver and firepower. Young subalterns, who had only days before been cursing the name of Brigadier Brooke for the last-minute delay, now spoke knowledgeably of the feint and the end run, as if it had been the plan all along. The battle was already being codified, its raw, unpredictable reality being pressed and dried between the pages of after-action reports, destined to become a case study in staff colleges for generations to come. It was a triumph of strategy, they said, a textbook example of how to dismantle a defensive position. On the German side, the recriminations were bitter and private. In the prisoner of war cages, captured officers from Panzergruppe Becker seethed with a sense of betrayal. They blamed the High Command for its incompetence, for issuing a nonsensical order and then leaving them to be slaughtered. Field Marshal Kesselring, in his own reports to the Führerhauptquartier, cited a catastrophic failure of signals security and unforgivable indiscipline at the divisional level, carefully shifting the blame away from his own strategic oversight. The truth, a trainee's thumb slipping on a dial, was too absurd, too humiliating to be committed to paper. It was buried under layers of official jargon and mutual accusation, and so the myth was born and set in stone. For decades, historians would analyze the maps, the troop movements, the timetables. They would praise General Alexander's audacity and the fighting spirit of the British infantry. The name Wadi Akarit would be a footnote in the final chapter of the North African campaign, a well-executed battle that broke the back of the Axis defense in Tunisia. But in the classified archives, in a vault deep beneath the old War Office building in London, a different truth was preserved. The file, stamped, most secret, and sealed until the year 1975, contained the unvarnished record. There were the original intercept logs from Malta, Corporal Arthur Jenkins's neat script noting the poor signal strength. There was Evelyn Hart's brilliant, prescient analysis sheet, with its damning conclusion, high probability of significant operational transmission error. There were the frantic minutes from the command conference where Brigadier Brooke had gambled his career. And there was the final, internal citation, a single sheet of paper recommending formal recognition for 2 individuals. Only 2 names. Evelyn Hart, G.C., grade clerk, civil service, for exceptional perspicacity and analytical rigor in the interpretation of signals intelligence, directly leading to the preservation of Allied forces and a decisive victory. Brigadier Sir Lawrence Brooke, D.S.O., for exemplary judgment and moral courage in acting upon unorthodox intelligence, at grave personal and professional risk. There were no medals for them, no parades. Hart's citation was buried in her personnel file, a secret pat on the back. Brooke received a slightly more prestigious decoration, but the true reason for it was known only to a handful of men in the innermost circles of British intelligence. The public story remained one of generals and maneuvers. A battle had been won, not by overwhelming force, nor by sheer genius, nor by the irresistible power of artillery. It had been won in the space between a mistake and its perception. It was a victory carved from a single, shimmering thread of error that no one else had seen, noticed by a young woman who understood the grammar of war better than the generals who waged it, and believed by a man who had the courage to listen. The final, ironic twist in the tale would not emerge for over 40 years. In the mid-1980s, a retired German signals officer named Klaus Fischer, the very same Oberleutnant who had been conducting the fateful training drill, published a slim volume of his wartime memoirs in a small press in Bavaria. It attracted little attention, a niche book for military history enthusiasts. In it, he recounted the story of the Phantom Order of WW2, a story he had carried with him like a shard of shrapnel for decades, a burden of guilt and absurdity. A British historian, researching the Tunisian campaign, stumbled upon the book. The account was stunning in its detail. Fisher described the training tent, the nervous Gefreiter, the simulated order for a Panzergruppe to reposition, and then he revealed the final, breathtaking layer of the mistake. The call signs and unit designations he had used in that drill were not for Panzergruppe Becker, the unit that had inexplicably moved. They were for a completely different unit, Panzergruppe Schwarz, which was stationed hundreds of kilometers to the south, in a quiet sector of the front line near the Mered line. The trainee, in his panic and fatigue, had not only broadcast on the wrong frequency, he had also garbled the unit designation within the encoded message itself. The Enigma machine at Panzergruppe Becker's headquarters, upon decoding it, had automatically corrected the flawed unit identifier to their own, a common, if tragic, procedural flaw when dealing with slightly corrupted signals. The scrambled message wasn't even meant for the Panzergruppe that moved. It was a case of double misdirection. The wrong frequency, the wrong units, the wrong region of the front. A perfect storm of human error, a cascade of tiny, insignificant mistakes piling one upon the other like a house of cards. The British had intercepted a German training message, meant for a fictional exercise for a unit that wasn't there, which was accidentally obeyed by a unit that was never supposed to receive it. The chaos that resulted from this series of errors had created a gap in the line so illogical, so strategically absurd, that no British planner would ever have dared to propose an attack through it, for fear of it being the most obvious trap in military history. But because one person, Evelyn Hart, had spotted the subtle sloppiness in that phantom signal, and because another, Lawrence Brooke, had believed in her judgment, the entire battle had flipped upside down. The victory was not just built on a mistake, but on a mistake of almost comical proportions, a farce playing out in the wings while the tragedy of war occupied the main stage. The truth, when it finally came to light, did not rewrite the history books. The grand narrative of the Second World War was too vast, too firmly established, to be altered by this single, strange anecdote. WW2 remained a textbook victory, but for those who knew the full story, it stood as something else entirely. A monument not to the infallibility of command, but to its opposite, to the power of paying attention, to the courage of trusting a hunch, and to the profound, unsettling truth that the tides of history can sometimes be turned not by the great and the powerful, but by a glitch in a radio and the keen, unyielding eyes of a girl who refused to look away.